Welcome to TaiwanTalks, covering the latest global news from a Taiwan perspective. I'm Albert Chiu. In the past month, China welcomed U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, and John Kerry, the climate envoy. Visit by high-level officials raises the question of whether the 5-year trade war between China and the United States is moving towards a potential resolution. Joining us today are Lev Nachman, National Chengchi University Assistant Professor, Arthur Dean, National Chengchi University Professor Emeritus, and the Taiwan U.S China military experts, and Peifen Hsieh, Democratic Progressive Party spokesperson and Director of Department of International Affairs. A very warm welcome to all on the show. To begin, let us consider a report from the New York Times, which highlights that China's current economic slowdown plays a significant role in its willingness to resume diplomatic engagement with Western countries. The downturn in China's economy has prompted its senior officials to proactively engage in diplomatic dialogues with the geopolitical rivals, concurrently encouraging a more transparent approach to addressing domestic economic challenges. So I guess my first question goes to Lev. So what's your take on this?
You know, even though COVID has relatively ended and China has begun to open up and people have traveled, there's clearly a lot of domestic frustration with the rate at which the economy has begun to bounce back. Not only do you have domestic economic slowdown, you have high unemployment. And one of the key ways that China is still able to kind of try to fix this is to try to welcome back Western investment and to try to warm up relations. Now, the challenge there is that from a national security perspective, it's been doing the opposite. So the challenge for China is to try to find a way in order to sort of create this economic policy that is more welcoming to Western investment, while still trying to navigate its relatively wolfish, as we like to say, national security approach to dealing with the United States.
Okay, the latest data from the U.S. shows China has relinquished its status as the United States' largest importer for the first time in 15 years. It reveals a substantial decline in goods imported from China during the period from January to May of this year, amounting to approximately 25%, leading to a reduced total value of $169 billion compared to the corresponding period last year. So I guess my second question goes to Peifen, Spokesperson Hsieh. How do we interpret this data in relation to changes in the China-U.S. relations and trade? In your perspective?
I think we have to distinguish between decoupling and de-risking. So for decoupling, as according to Yellen, it would be a huge mistake because, well, the United States, Americans can purchase goods from China at a very low price. But whereas de-risking is now inevitable and decoupling is impractical. De-risking is an idea that was first proposed by the President of the European Commission in March and was included in the communique of the G7 summit meeting. And then it was proposed again by President Biden, Jack Sullivan, and others. Because for the United States to trade with China is important, but it also has to prioritize its national security over economy and trade. So for national security reasons, for example, for semiconductors and high-tech products, it's very important for the United States to really put an emphasis on this kind of products. And this is where the de-risking comes in. De-risking would be something I would believe that the United States would really emphasize in the future, while still communicate, while still conduct trade relations with China.
So, well, I mean, I think you raise a very great point that now there's a distinction between the de-risking and also decoupling. Even the most conservative wing of the U.S. politician would not argue against the total decoupling with China. Okay, Professor Dean, what's your take on the same question?
Well, I would say, since we all know that since year 2020, when China entered the World Trade Organization, China gradually, through years, China became the largest trade partner for almost all the countries in the world, frankly speaking, including United States, European countries, including Taiwan, including ASEAN countries. You know, so that is a fact. So if we want to totally cut off this kind of trade, it probably is extremely impractical, I would say. But as Peifen already mentioned, the risk is try to restrict those items with heavily national security considerations. So other than that, as by Secretary Blinken or Janet Yellen already said, for the other items, other goods, the trade can be continued as before. So this is the effect that since we all know that, as I said, since year 2000, China entered the WTO. China really become the largest world trade partner for almost all the countries in the world. Yeah, since year 2017, when President Trump came to office and want to raise the so-called tariff from China for those goods import from China, and this created we call the reshoring. You know, many of the factory moving to Southeast Asia or to other parts of the world, but it will take tremendous time, frankly speaking. And another issue is that, for instance, like Vietnam's. Vietnam, in terms of the size, Vietnam among only about the almost 1 billion population, but China has almost 1.2 billion population. Okay. So the size is completely different, and the whole system is different. So China become the so-called world factory since year 2000. They can provide all kinds of products, but Vietnam start enter this kind of join the world so-called trade system a little bit later than China. Right. So Vietnam also has its so-called obstacle now. For instance, its size is smaller, and the system is not so comprehensive as China has. And also we all know that most recent, Vietnam has so-called some kind of a public infrastructure problem, like electricity supply of the electricity is not sufficient. So it will take tremendous time to for the foreign factories moving out from China and to other parts of the world. It takes tremendous time.
Okay. Professor Nachman, both mentioned about the de-risking and also decoupling. I guess the key is that whether or not the United States still avoid to have anything to do with China regarding the high-tech stuff, for example, semiconductors. Would you agree with this kind of distinction?
Yeah, it's really worth taking some time to think about this new word, de-risking, because it's a brand new phrase. It's amazing our ability to sort of invent jargon on the spot. Right. But it's meaningful. The words we use for foreign policy are meaningful. So, for some people, I think they look at this term de-risking and say, well, that's just a euphemism for decoupling. It's the same thing. We're just giving it a nicer name. And I don't think that's true. I think there's meaningful purpose behind creating a new word, because I do think that many people do not want to decouple, but they want something that at least allows for a different policy agenda that allows for more diversity and as the word implies, creates less risk for countries. So for example, if a policy is to not lessen one's economic reliance on China, but rather diversify one's economic trade partners, that's not decoupling, that's de-risking. That's creating more pathways. So I think it's important to keep in mind that when we talk about this new word, because we're going to see this word de-risking a lot going forward. Okay,
well, can I, in other words, say that don't put all the eggs in the same basket, that kind of idea, right. I mean, to the United States. Okay, on the other hand, let's approach the data from a diametrically different perspective. Despite the efforts of both countries to decouple and lessen their trade interdependency since the initiation of the China-U.S. trade war, recent data reveals that the trade volume between the two nations has reached a new peak. Does this suggest that economic dependence between China and the United States remains deeply rooted and inherently challenging to disentangle? Still the question goes to Professor Ding.
Yeah, as I said, since year 2000, China became the largest trade partner for almost all the countries in the world. So, as I said, it takes tremendous time for so-called reshoring or moving factory to other parts of the world. And we have to remember that even in most recently, several top high-tech company in the United States, they try to lobby the U.S. administration not to sort of lose the China market, because we all know that whether it's Apple, whether it's Nvidia, they become the world's largest the company because they heavily rely on revenue from China market.
Right.
And they also heavily rely on the profit from this kind of a China market. So with this kind of revenue and the profit, they can make an investment in their R&D and continue to be the leading firm in the world in these high-tech sectors. So that's why it's, as I said, it's totally impractical to cut off this kind of a market with China. So this is a kind of a reality. So
right, kind of in response to spokesperson Hsieh, you just mentioned that decoupling is impractical. De-risking is possible, even though that this is a new jargon to you. But would you kind of explain why the recent data shows that the trade volume between United States and China has reached a new peak?
Yeah, I think, well, if we look in an overview of only the trade volume, then that includes everything, all kinds of items and products. But if you look into like high-tech products, which is more national security sensitive, then you can find that the United States government has been more and more cautious about this kind of products. So in terms of national security, I think it can change, well, that can change from time to time. So currently, the semiconductor high-tech is like, well, the United States is in a leading role, whereas China depends largely on the imports from the United States and some from Taiwan and other countries as well. But for example, during the COVID-19 period, before COVID-19, nobody would think of that medical products would be also of national security concerns. But then during the COVID-19 period, then people realize that if you all concentrate all of the production of medical products in one country, and then if that country cannot produce in time, or that country for some reasons cannot perform, then well the whole production was shut down, and that also became a national security issue. So what I'm saying is that although the total trade volume seems to be huge, but then if you look into the specific items, then people are starting to look into the specific items and realize that, okay, maybe this for this item they need to diversify, and for this certain item it's too risky to be produced in China, and for the other items maybe other like Mexico, Canada, and other countries can be a more ideal countries of products, origins of products. So for example, in the past months, we also see that imports from Mexico, from Canada to the United States have increased a lot, and also imports from ASEAN to the United States have also increased a lot as well. I think this also shows the trend of diversification in the United States.
Right, so the whole picture is more complicated than we originally think about. Okay, the U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen recently expressed her intention to bolster collaborative efforts considering the softening in U.S.-China relations amidst global economic challenges. Nonetheless, Secretary Yellen also acknowledged that concerns persist regarding China's unfair trade practices, warranting caution before considering the removal of tariffs imposed by the previous Trump administration. So what are the sticking points and barriers in U.S.-China economic exchanges? In which areas might progress be made in the future? So maybe this one goes to Professor Nachman.
Yeah, so the biggest challenge, of course, like Director Hsieh said, is going to be national security. So any industry that is connected to national security is going to be a very big challenge to find cooperation on. Not only that, but human rights also continues to be a barrier in which the United States still rightfully has many reservations of trading with certain individuals or certain industries because of human rights violations. Now, I do think there are still areas for cooperation, places like agriculture, places like the environment, these sort of less inherently politicized areas of trade that I do think the United States and China still can find an important pathway to resume hopefully high levels of trade and cooperation on.
Okay, well actually President Biden, his diplomacy policy is such competition but not conflict with China, indicates the U.S. willingness to continue economic engagement with China, except in high-tech areas like what you mentioned, such as semiconductors and stuff. Can this approach be effective in the future, Professor Ding, do you think?
I would say there are several approaches for Biden's the overall foreign policy. The first one to build unity itself and create more jobs, so-called the middle class economy or the middle class diplomacies. And also is to bring the traditional allied members back. Basically, I would say the scorecard for President Biden is pretty good, I would say, in general speaking. We see many of the traditional allies come back from Korea to Japan and even the Philippines. And look at the sanction export control against China. You know, most recently, when Wang Yi met Secretary Blinken and the other top-ranking U.S. government officials, one of the appealing from Wang Yi that to stop those kind of sanctions and not to interfere China's domestic economic development. So we can see, I would say, so far, President Biden's this kind of action is quite successful because, you know, China knows that, you know, without this kind of advanced IC chips, China really cannot compete, and it takes tremendous time, years, for China to, you know, to make their own, you know, to be kind of self-sufficient and self-reliant. So basically, I would say President Biden's approach so far, I would say, is pretty good. I would say,
it's still pretty effective.
Yeah.
Spokesperson Hsieh, so will you say that President Hsieh is willing to accept this, you know, so-called competition but not conflict approach?
I'm less optimistic. I think the U.S. and China relations is inherently confrontational, and it's more and more so. So it's really hard for them to only compete without confrontation, without conflict. Why would I say so? Because I think both of the United States and China are worried that the other will weaponize trade, and they do have done so. For example, the Chinese government has weaponized its trade relations with Australia and with Taiwan. The Australian red wine and the agricultural products from Taiwan and all the others. And also the United States, they, for national security reasons, for the protection of their own technologies and for other reasons, they have also implemented export regulations. So for both of them, it's really hard for them to just like economy is the only economy and politics is only politics. I think for both countries, the economy and politics and the relations between the two are intertwined. Right. So it's really hard for them to only have competition but no confrontation.
Okay. All right. Dennis Ong, Associate Professor of Political Science at the Sam Houston State University, has helped TaiwanTalks interview Michael Cunningham, Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center, where he discusses the limited impact of U.S. China tensions on China's economy and highlights the intricacies Taiwan faces in dealing with heightened tensions between the United States and China. Let's take a look.
The intensifying competition between the U.S. and China has significant implications for China's economy. Michael, how do you assess the impact of this competition on China's economy? What are the key areas affected, and what are the implications for China's economic growth prospect?
So the impact of U.S.-China tensions on China's economy so far has actually been quite limited. China's economy has a lot of problems right now. Most of them fall, what I would say, under two categories. One is just the natural consequences of China's development up to this point, that it's no longer a low cost, high growth, high return economy. The development gap that it had has largely been filled, and it was never expected to grow at high rates indefinitely. But then the other, I think, main factor here is the CCP's own policies. Since Xi Jinping has come to power, growth has gradually declined, and that's not a side effect of Xi's policies. I would say they actually are one of the points of Xi's policies is that the policies in the past 10 years or so have been directed at mitigating risks as a higher priority than growth just for growth's sake. And so, if China really wants to get its growth back at higher levels and it wants to prioritize that, then there's a lot more it can do with its own policies. It's not being affected as much by the U.S. China tensions. U.S. China trade is actually still quite strong. Bilateral trade hit new records last year. But U.S. China tensions are affecting areas that China cares about more than they care about economic growth. So it is affecting China's ability to acquire sensitive technologies and to develop its own indigenous technologies. So these are the areas where U.S. China tensions are really starting to bite China. But as far as the economy goes, yes, they're helping to exacerbate some of the problems China's already having, but these problems are more internal to China than they are related to the geopolitics.
What is your take? The situation across between the U.S. and China will have some impact on Taiwan. What Taiwan can do in terms of dealing with the escalated tension between U.S. and China? What's your take?
This is one of the biggest challenges that Taiwan's leadership has to, well, really the biggest challenge Taiwan's leadership has to face. The U.S. doesn't quite understand the complexity and the many facets of Taiwan's relationship with China. So the U.S. only sees the security threat, the threat to Taiwan's sovereignty. Taiwan sees China as both a political and security threat and as an economic lifeline. So it's very much dependent on China, on its trade with China. This dependence on trade with China affects Taiwan's stance towards China, but even more, Taiwan's stance towards China is affected by the security concerns. Taiwan has been dealing with these for decades, understands better than really anyone in Washington or anyone anywhere in the world outside of Beijing the risk associated with dancing too close to China's red lines on Taiwan. Previously, the U.S. very much appreciated Taiwan's cautious approach towards relations with China, whereas now I think that's still appreciated in policy circles, but at the same time, I think there are more people who are maybe a bit newer to this issue, who are advising policymakers and really want to see Taiwan take a much harder stance towards China. Now, this is something that it's just going to make it more difficult for Taiwan to thread the needle to navigate this. Taiwan is essentially stuck in between, in the middle of the U.S.-China competition. It has to manage tensions and also manage its economic relations with China, while at the same time ensuring that it doesn't end up getting gobbled up by China.
So there's a concern, in Taiwan because of the trade relations with China. So a lot of people in Taiwan or our audience in Taiwan really want to know whether the U.S. will lend a hand on Taiwan and provide the market, grant the market access through the so-called free trade agreement or any kind of trade deal. But at the same time, we also know the U.S. American audience also concerned about the free trade or globalization may hurt American interests. What is your take on this issue, whether the U.S. will grant Taiwan market access because we try to help Taiwan get rid of the dependence? What is the major issues or concern or obstacles to have Taiwan on Americans, the opening market list?
Yeah, that's a really good question. This whole issue of a U.S.-Taiwan free trade agreement has been around for as long as I can remember, and it hasn't happened before, and there are reasons for that. Now, I would say also, and as you pointed out, Dennis, the sentiment in the U.S. towards free trade agreements is quite negative right now, but the sentiment towards Taiwan has never been better. And so I would say if we were talking about a multilateral free trade agreement with many different countries, I would say the chance of that is essentially zero right now. But if we're talking a free trade agreement between the U.S. and Taiwan, well, I think the political will is either there or quite close to being there. Now, I think it'll take time. There are many issues that would need to be ironed out. But after all, at least in my opinion, free trade agreements tend to be driven more by politics and political concerns than by economic and trade concerns. And from that perspective, there is a lot of interest on the U.S. side in helping Taiwan in this way.
So, Professor Ding, do you have any kind of follow-up to his comments?
I would say this is part of our issue of our daily debate. How should we how should we go out of this kind of dilemma? I would say, but we do see a little bit change these days. For instance, our trade volume with China is declining. And the so-called traditional dependency is declining a little bit, and our trade, our outbound investment to China also declined very substantially. But instead, our trade and with United States grow a lot. So we can see, this kind of economic gradual shifting. Taiwan, security speaking, we heavily rely on the United States. So how can we, make this kind of a balance? So maybe we do need to have close economic and security relationship with United States and probably Japan, because we import tremendous raw material for the high tech from Japan. And our sources of high technologies for those IC also patent also from United States. So inevitably we have to keep this kind of a closer economic and even security relationship with United States and Japan. And with China, no doubt, China is our neighbors, So some kind of a good working relationship is important. But the question is how far we need to keep this kind of relationship at the expense of our so-called sovereign and independent. So this is quite a debatable issue inside Taiwan. But I would say basically people more and more realize we should keep our so-called de facto independent without the expense of our independent.
Spokesperson Hsieh can jump in later on, but in a minute. But really quick, Professor Nachman, what's your take on this? Kind of add up too.
Yeah, I think I really appreciate his pointing out that many in America do not fully appreciate the complexity. I think for some politicians in the United States, they might look at Taiwan and say, well, why doesn't Taiwan just trade less with China? As if it was such a simple issue. But I think that there is more need for, I think, senators and politicians in the United States to fully appreciate just how complex Taiwan's contested status is and its relationship with China.
Right. Okay. Spokesperson Hsieh.
I think one thing he mentioned was that the political support for Taiwan in the United States is strong right now, and I think that's really a momentum for us because before and currently, well, the United States politics is also very polarized. But only one thing, maybe only that thing that they can have consensus upon is their attitude toward China and toward Taiwan. And I think that's why just not long ago we have concluded the negotiation and signed the Taiwan-U.S. initiative on the 21st century trade, and that's really a step forward. And also, the United States is currently not engaging in FTA talks with any countries. That's really promising. The 21st century trade is something that's really promising for us. And I think for Taiwan, we really have to take on this opportunity to build a closer economic tie with the United States, and in the meantime to kind of decoupling or not, but it's also a trend in the world that's the restructuring of a global supply chain is taking place. And that's really an opportunity for Taiwan to really think seriously which route we would like to go to have a more closer relations with the United States and other free markets, or to even lock ourselves into more closely with the Chinese markets.
Okay, let's come back to the great power struggle. The two great powers, China and the United States, stand as the world's two largest economies, jointly accounting for 40% of global GDP. Consequently, we need to understand the economic conditions and outlook of both nations to ascertain which country is poised to maintain a robust position in the face of prevailing challenges. According to the announcements by the National Bureau of Statistics of China, GDP recorded an annual growth rate of 6.3% in the second quarter, falling short of projections of 7% or higher, less than expected. This suggests a slower economic recovery. The Wall Street Journal goes further, characterizing China's economic growth as entering the substantial recession, while many Chinese business owners exhibit pessimism about the future and reluctance to invest. Reuters even expressed concerns that China might face prolonged challenges in achieving prosperity. So, I wonder if China now really step in a period, or maybe longer period of a recession. Maybe Professor Ding.
Yes, we all know that the GDP is composed of three elements. The first one is foreign trade. We already see China trade is declining with United States and so on and so forth. And China's consumption also declining, particularly in the past 2 years. China does not have so-called a good welfare system. So the people have to save money for their own futures, And the investment, either foreign investment, FDI, or the domestic investment also declining in the past couple of years. Then is any way for China to go out of this kind of a problem? Frankly speaking, I'm a little bit pessimistic because for investment, they need the confidence. But the problem is that, on the one hand, we see Xi Jinping tighten up the so-called national security law, and tighten up domestic control to an extremely severe level, I would say. So how can you call back those investors' confidence, whether it's domestic investor or the foreign investors? And the consumption, there's China entered the so-called aging society. We all know that. So people have to save their own money for the futures. So basically speaking, all kinds of figures, really do not portray a promising future, I would say, for China's economic development down the road, at least in the probably next several years, I would say.
But President Xi firmly believes what he called as an internal circulation. So Professor Nachman, do you think that's going to work without any kind of external world's exchange in trade and business, and they can still survive?
I think, the question of can they survive, of course they can, but I think it's a matter of trying to bolster their own domestic legitimacy and to regain the trust of the public. I think, not to say that there's distrust from the public, but high unemployment rates, slowing economic growth are conditions that the CCP would rather avoid if they can. And I think it's a matter of trying to find policy implementations that can at the very least lower the risk of the CCP facing some sort of other kind of protest crisis like they faced with the white paper revolution earlier this year.
So Spokesperson Hsieh, would you say that the economic growth in the past really served as pretty much the sole legitimacy for this type of regime to go on, to continue? But now, seemingly that it disappeared.
Indeed, I think before China entered WTO, there was the hope for China and also for other countries, including the United States. That once they include China into the world order, then China will become one of us. But then, the Chinese government and Chinese markets take advantage of the WTO and the free trade system. But then they take that they turn that into their own benefit. benefits. So now their economy has prospered, but their politics has not reformed. And even so, their politics has been more and more authoritarian and more power concentrated. And that's something that wasn't expected when they first entered WTO. So they are reaping the economic benefits without taking any responsibilities. Because I think that's really serve as what you said, that really economy and the prosperity of the Chinese society in the past 2 decades really serve as a legitimacy for the CCP government. And it's even harder for the people to protest and also to complain about the government, because the government would say, well, now your life is, you are living a pretty well life, then what are you complaining about? So that's really something that wasn't expected when they entered WTO.
Right. Let's take another chart. In June, the annual increase in the U.S. core consumer price index, so-called CPI, dipped below 3%, marking the lowest level since October 2021. The U.S. economy continues to exhibit resilience, with inflation showing signs of cooling down. Quite sort of like optimistic on the other side of the Pacific. A favorable prospect of a soft landing on the horizon, leading financial institutions such as Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan Chase have recently adjusted their assessment of a potential U.S. recession. So revising down the risk, Professor Nachman, so what's your views regarding this?
Yeah, I think this is just a clear sign that after years of pandemic life, Americans want to get out and do stuff, and I think this is a sign that people are spending.
To buy stuff, to sell stuff.
People want to go out, they want to travel, they want to buy things. More people my age are buying houses. I think it's really a sign that a complete opposite of kind of what's been happening in the PRC, but I think that the U.S. economic policies have really been pushing for more growth. And I think it's a sign that perhaps President Biden's post-COVID economic plan has been somewhat of a success. Now, of course, there's reasons to still be somewhat concerned, something that we've talked about on this show before, the idea of student loans.
Right.
One of the big reasons people under the age of 40 have been able to buy houses and been able to spend so much is because we have not had to pay back the tens of thousands of dollars that we owe. But that's going to start up again this October.
Yeah, that's very intriguing. Would you say this is exactly because of the system difference? For example, in China now, you don't see this housing sold that much, even there's a recession about it, just because the system is closed. It's kind of prevent itself from the external world. Whereas in the United States, of course, it's a big market, it's a global market that in and out so much. Would you say it has to do with the political system out there?
Oh, of course. I think that's one of the main reasons why we're able to, at the very least, know exactly what the United States economic conditions are. This is one of the challenges with trying to study China's domestic economy is, of course, you always have to take some numbers with a grain of salt, while in the United States we at least have, very transparent information about where exactly our markets are.
Right. Okay. Professor Dean, yeah, about the U.S. Recovery in economy. Now it's pretty good. Looks pretty good.
Yeah, if you look at the many of the figures, basically U.S. is performed quite well, I would say. Now, as you say, the CPI is declining, and the people's wage is growth above the CPI now, and the housing price declining, and the energy price also declining, the so-called gas, so on and so forth. So people start to spend money now. So basically, I would say the U.S. economy looks much better than what we see in China. Yeah.
Okay. In the 1980s, President Deng Xiaoping, let's look at the history a bit. His decision was to open Chinese market to the world, garner approval from Western democracies, notably the United States, driven by the belief that participation in the global economy could potentially lead China to shade its authoritarianism. However, as several decades have transpired, it has become evident that China's political system has proven resistant to significant change, despite reaping benefits from the market economy during the 1990s and 2000s. This is pretty much the point Spokesperson Hsieh mentioned. So goes to you. Would you say that the thinking of the U.S. or other democracies was a mistake to kind of give China a chance to invite China to join the world economy system? But in the end, that was a dream, a distant dream. Yeah.
Mistake or not, I would say that's wishful thinking of them. So at that time, they really hope that the Chinese will go onto the Western model, which is to once you become rich, you have the middle class, and then they would fight for democracy.
Right.
But the later part didn't happen, and the richness of the Chinese society rather gives the Chinese leadership confidence in themselves. So now they become very confident. They become they really believe that they are the driving force of their economy growth, and that's something that also we should see in the COVID-19 period. So during the COVID-19 period, they have implemented very strict rules regarding going out, buying stuff. So their economy really hurts a lot. But now the leadership has become so overly confident that I think this will in turn hurt the Chinese economy, and also that someday, maybe one day, they will realize that in the past 2 decades or so, the economic growth in China is really largely because of the inclusion of the world order, the world economic order. But once they want to kind of exclude themselves out of this world order, or they want to trump themselves over this world order, then they will have to suffer.
Okay, now let's reserve some time for Taiwan. Again, history. President Ma Ying-jeou, when he was in the office, there was a notable easing of cross-trade tensions, facilitating Taiwan's companies' access to the expensive Chinese markets. However, this positive development came with associated costs, the implementation of the so-called one-stop business chain. Though advantages to specific enterprise in Taiwan and China contributed to a widening wealth gap within Taiwan, the failure to address this wealth disparity emerged as one of the factors that led to the KMT's loss in 2016 presidential election. These circumstances prompt two key questions. The first one is Taiwan's economic prosperity intrinsically reliant on China? And the second, is Taiwan gradually adapting to a new economic model that is less dependent on China? So I wonder, maybe for Professor Nachman, are we now in a totally new stage?
Yeah, you know, going back to when we talk about the difference between, say, decoupling and de-risking, I think Taiwan has always been with a policy of de-risking, because I think it is nearly impossible for Taiwan to really decouple from China for all sorts of very complicated reasons.
Yeah.
And you know, so much of the Tsai administration's policy has not been about you know, lessening trade with China as much as it's been diversifying Taiwan's trade. We've seen that with, you know, robust trade deals with the United States, the new southbound policy. I think this really shows that what Taiwan has been trying to do and what it will continue to do is not create a new paradigm of economic relations with China, but rather to try to find ways to sort of diversify how it's able to you know, create space for itself with other countries along with China. So not so much cutting off from China as much as finding other outlets to also create trade opportunities. Right,
that's good. I would like to specifically talking about the wealth disparity, Professor Dean. Is that whenever we have a better relations with China, the trades, you know, people make money from you know, business with China, but always it benefits a small segments of the population in Taiwan. So what's your take on this? Any kind of solution to that? If in the future maybe Taiwan and China relations warm up again, and might be the same problem, you know, but how are we gonna solve this kind of problem?
Well. The so-called distribution of wealth is a pretty big question for Taiwan, I would say. We learned something, frankly speaking. You know, we all know that in President Ma's terms, he encouraged Taiwan businessmen make reinvestment in Taiwan, bring the money back from China. The question is that it's right to bring the money back to Taiwan, but the problem is that he didn't develop a kind of mechanism at that time. So those money back from China can make a reinvestment in those sectors we really need, frankly speaking. So at the end, almost all the money, back to Taiwan, but making investment in the housing sector. So pushing up our housing price.
Right.
And we all suffer, frankly speaking. So again, when President Tsai came to office, he learned something from these kind of problems. So President Tsai also welcomed money back from China, but he set up the mechanism institution. So the money can make an investment in those sectors we really need, for instance, high tech or others. So not to concentrate on the so-called real estate alone. But again, the money is too much, I would say. So again, in the past couple years, we see the housing price in President Tsai's second term went up a little bit.
Right.
And so people start to complain. So this is, I would say, this is a big lesson we really need to learn now. Because China's size is so big and we are a small economy, frankly speaking. So how to, so-called distribution of wealth is really a tough issue we have to face.
Right, Spokesperson Hsieh, like he mentioned that, that's a brilliant point that the economic exchange between the two states always leads up to some kind of negative societal consequence. And what's your observation of this?
Yeah, indeed, I think as the economy grows, that is indeed one of the consequences. So this is where the government comes in. So the government needs to really address the wealth disparity issues and social benefits issues. So those people who are not winners in this kind of trade models can also, be compensated by the government. I think this really is something that President Tsai has been taking great care of. And this is really something that is really a huge comparison with between President Tsai and President Ma, and that's why, as you mentioned, in toward the end of President Ma's term, his approval rate drops because of all this wealth disparity issues with the trade with China, where when people in Taiwan didn't want that. So I think this is really something that the economy, on the economy side, there will be winners and losers from certain trade models. But on the political and societal side, and the government has to come in, has to really compensate those who do not benefit from the trade.
We explored the potential of a decoupled U.S. China economy and acknowledged its impracticability in certain aspects. Additionally, we delved into the significance of Taiwan's role in the global economic landscape. Did you enjoy the content of this episode? Feel free to leave a comment and do not forget to hit the subscribe button. Until next time, take care.